Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Progressive American. I'm your host, Connor Kelly. Today, I am sitting here with Max Boot, a scholar historian and senior fellow with the Council on Foreign Relations and contributor to the Washington Post. We're discussing his new book, Reagan, His Life and Legend. Thank you for joining me, Max.
Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. So, I guess when we start off with these historical figures, we always have to ask the question, why significant? Why do these figures matter so much to our memory? And I guess in the simplest of ways, why Reagan? Why did you choose to write about Reagan and in the context of our modern politics?
Well, Ronald Reagan was a very consequential president, whatever you may think of him. He was obviously an important figure in the 20th century. He was, I saw firsthand how important he was because I grew up in the 1980s and he kind of loomed over my life and the life of the entire world. And then, when I was thinking about what book I would write after my last one came out, uh, I was thinking, there's a lot of books about Ronald Reagan. And there's some good books, but there has not really been a definitive biography. There was not a book that really treated his life uh, in whole and provided a balanced account that was both good and bad. And so that's what I set out to do more than a decade ago, to write a book that was neither a hagiography nor a hit job, but really fair and balanced, that showed Reagan's successes as well as his failures, his strengths as well as his shortcomings. And so I was very delighted to see just recently that the New Yorker Review said that this Reagan, His Life and Legend, sets out to be the definitive biography, and it succeeds. So that was kind of a mission accomplished moment for me.
Yeah, and I would say like a lot of times when we're discussing any historical figure, whether it's on the national stage like a president or on a local or even collegiate level, there is a kind of a tendency to be hesitant to criticize those figures. I know in the past, other historians have had difficulty with Reagan's complicated character. Edmund Morris comes to mind in his biography, so much so that he creates a fictional character. But to get to the kind of the point of the historiography behind Reagan, you in a piece in August you made this point about the somewhat contradictory nature of his character, namely that he was both an ideologue, but also he was just also a pragmatist. And I was wondering, when you first started out with this work in 2013, what were some of the complications that came up with trying to balance that reality in your research?
Well, there were a lot of paradoxes in Reagan, that because he was often accused of having simplistic views, but he was definitely not a simple man, and that you just pointed out to one of his paradoxes, which is that he could be very intensely ideological, but he could also be very pragmatic and compromise and get things done. And so, as governor and as president, he upended a lot of expectations. But that's only one of his paradoxes. Another paradox is that he was famously confrontational as a political leader. He fired the airline traffic controllers in '81 when they went on strike. He called the Soviet Union the evil empire, said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. So very confrontational in public, but I found in private he was actually very averse to personal confrontations. He was averse to personal conflict. He was actually somebody who shied away from clashes with either his kids or with aides, and so never really disciplined anybody. And so I think the final paradox that is kind of central to understanding who Ronald Reagan was that on TV he came across as kind of this very genial, avuncular, friendly neighbor next door type of person. And yet, people who really knew him said that he was actually very cold, and there was like a glacial reserve at his core, that he never really got close to anybody. As Jim Baker, his first term White House chief of staff, said to me, "You could never forget with Reagan that we were all just hired hands, and he could be very grateful for our help one day, and then we could be gone the next day, and he'd never even notice that we were gone." So, he was not quite the person he appeared to be on TV, and uh, I traced a lot of these quirks of his character back to his very difficult itinerant childhood in small town Illinois in the early 20th century, where his father was an alcoholic shoe salesman. The family was often moving from town to town as his father, Jack Reagan, lost jobs. And often Jack would go off on multi day benders and come home, and there would be a lot of screaming between Jack and Nellie, his wife, and Ronald Reagan's mother, and so Little Dutch Reagan, as he was known, never really got close to the other kids because he kept moving from town to town, and he also developed a horror of kind of personality conflict and wanted to keep everything at kind of a very safe, keep everybody to safe remove, and to keep his interactions with other people at a very safe and superficial level of kind of geniality, and not really dig under the surface. So he didn't really know what was going on in his kids' lives, didn't really know about a lot of the conflicts his aides were engaged in. He kind of hovered above it all. And so, I think you really have to go back to his childhood to untangle this very complicated personality.
So yeah, that kind of isolationism of the personality that you were describing here with the feelings of like chaos in his childhood, I think that kind of is also seen in his view of the individual. Like a lot of his campaign ads emphasize the individual, the rights of the individual, and big government. Do you think to some extent that his childhood and the way in which he viewed separation from people as playing a part in his ideological inclinations, or do you think that was just a side thing that kind of came across through his political career?
Well, it's an interesting question. Quite honestly, I've never considered it. I'd have to think about that. I mean, I think he grew up in the atmosphere of the Midwest in the early 20th century, and I mean, he was born in 1911. This was a time before government grew in size, before a progressive income taxation, before a lot of things that, sorry, before
Bless
a
you.
lot of things that we take for granted. Um, so he was born to a very different, very laissez-faire America, which hasn't existed for an awfully long time. I think that shaped a lot of his views, but he was also, as a young man in the 1930s, he was a very ardent New Deal Democrat. His hero was FDR, and in fact, the New Deal saved his father because his father was unemployed during the Great Depression, got a job doling out aid in their hometown of Dixon, Illinois. So he was a very staunch liberal democratic supporter of FDR, and he changed very much later in life. And the explanation that he gave for that change was just not convincing to me when I dug into it, because he often said, "I didn't desert my party deserted me," to imply that the Democratic Party had veered far to the left and he had, stayed in the center. But in fact, he really became a Republican in the 1950s at a time when the Democratic Party was actually pretty darn conservative. I mean, that was the heyday of Sam Rayburn and Lyndon Johnson. In 1960, John F. Kennedy actually ran to Richard Nixon's right on defense policy. So it simply was not the case that the Democratic Party was somehow becoming some far left party, and Reagan couldn't stomach that. In fact, he changed very dramatically from his early years as a New Dealer to as he became in middle age, a very right wing conservative Republican.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that looking back, obviously, there's going to be a difference of perspective from generation to generation, and nobody should be surprised by a show calling The Progressive American having a little more of a critical view of Ronald Reagan. But I do think when we're looking at historical figures and their evolution in time, especially when it comes to their political ideology, which analyzing any political ideology is more of an art than an exact science. I think it's important for people to remember that the context in which a person exists change all the time. And what may affect one historical figure might not necessarily affect another in the same way. And for me, when I look at Reagan, I think it's very interesting to see a potential childhood influence showing up later in life because of that chaotic environment and just maybe a feeling of difference rather than an actual change within the party that he became frustrated with. But to the point of you finding his argument unconvincing, I think that kind of leads very well into dealing with the 45th president of the United States and how you've both described Ronald Reagan as being kind of occasionally engaging in mistruth, sometimes blatantly, and in much the same way that Donald Trump does, although probably to a much greater degree. So, my next question is: to what extent do you think that Ronald Reagan's lackluster truth telling plays a role in the modern state of the Republican Party and the state of Donald Trump and his role as a politico in America?
Well, I think there are huge differences between Reagan and Trump, and certainly a lot of differences on political issues. I mean, remember Reagan was pro-immigration, pro-free trade, pro-alliance, pro-NATO, pro standing up to Russian aggression. Uh, so, very different in many ways, and certainly a very different personality type from Trump. But there's no question that there are certain continuities that you can see when you chart the history of the Republican Party. And I think you can kind of see how Republicans got from Reagan to Trump, even though, despite their huge differences, uh, it starts with very superficial similarities, like the fact that they both hosted national TV shows before becoming president. They were both populists. They both ran on a slogan of "Make America Great Again." But I think there are also some, more troubling resemblances, including the fact that both of them played or catered to white backlash politics. Again, Trump has done it much more blatantly, but Reagan did it as well. You know, both of them engaged in populism that kind of demonized the government and undermined trust in the government, even though Reagan didn't use the term deep state, but he was nevertheless highly critical of the government, even when he was running it, and that helped to, further erode public confidence in the government. And certainly part of it is what you just mentioned about Reagan's often cavalier attitude towards the truth. And again, he certainly did not tell lies on the scale that Trump tells lies. I mean, nobody tells lies on that scale. And I would argue that, uh, Reagan never consciously told a lie. He believed everything he was saying, but a lot of what he was saying was just not so. And he was, he was somebody who was kind of more interested in emotional truth than in literal truth. He kind of thought that if a broader point was valid in his mind, like the communists are plotting against us, then the actual details of their plots didn't concern him that much. And he had a tendency to, he actually read a lot. This is actually one difference from Trump. Reagan actually read a lot, but while he was a voracious reader, he was also kind of an indiscriminate reader. So he often read sources that had dubious information, like Reader's Digest, Human Events, a lot of right wing publications. I even discovered that he was a reader of John Birch Society, pamphlets, and the Birchers were, the crazy far right of the 1960s. And so he tended to believe a lot of the stuff that he read, and he, uh, this became kind of the building blocks of his speeches, where he would warn about how social welfare legislation like Medicare and Medicaid was leading America towards communism, and then he would trot out quotes from leading communists like Lenin and Bukharin and others to reveal the supposed communist plot. Except all those quotes were basically made up by the John Birch Society, had no relationship to reality. Or he would often also like cite faux statistics. For example, he loved to say that no nation that has given one third of its income to the government has ever survived. And that was a very dubious assertion. And even in the 1960s, when there were plenty of nations in Western Europe where the government took more than a third of GDP. And today, that's true in pretty much every advanced democracy, including the United States. And we've all survived just fine. But, he kept insisting that this was the case. And finally, in the mid 60s, a graduate student asked him, Governor Reagan, where is your source? How do you back up this assertion about one third of national income? And Reagan's reply was, well, I read that an economist that said that a while ago. I just don't have that source anymore, but I read it a while ago. And that was it. I mean, and he kept right on saying it. So he really had a cavalier attitude towards, whether what he was saying was factually true or not, again, because he thought it was emotionally true. And you can certainly make the case that that kind of inured the Republican Party to phony facts, faux facts, which are, such a staple of Reagan's, of Trump's speeches. Although, in defense of Reagan, I will say that he never claimed that immigrants are eating your household pets.
Yeah, that one has become increasingly a problem for the obvious reasons of alleged bomb threats, and then also just the blatantly racist characterization of Haitian immigrants who are here legally. It should be added.
Right.
Um, but to the point of the truth and the source material that Reagan was reading, I've always wondered because to some extent he had an element of racism to him. For example, he was recently, well, not relatively, it was relatively recently that it was uncovered that he was on a call with then President Richard Nixon, where he basically said the Tanzanian delegation to the United Nations were not used to shoes and referred to them with racial epithets. I won't repeat
Right,
them on here for the obvious reasons. I don't want to invoke any of those.
right.
But to some extent, did you find in your research any connections to white citizens councils, or was it just more like red baiting rags like the John Birch Society?
Well, Reagan was certainly very supportive of, very right-wing politicians like Strom Thurmond and Jesse Helms, and they in turn were very supportive of him. And he certainly had a long time record of kind of catering to white grievances, but using kind of coded, ostensibly neutral language. It was certainly important to his political rise that he opposed civil rights legislation. He opposed the '64 Civil Rights Act. He opposed the '65 Voting Rights Act, and he often complained about, again using coded appeals about we don't want our streets to become jungle paths after dark, law and order, welfare queens, states' rights, busing, all these things that were kind of dog whistles to a lot of white voters to tell them, hey, this is the guy who's going to stand up against what they regard as these threats to their well-being from granting African American civil rights. Um, that was certainly a major part of his appeal, no question about it. Now, in terms of what his personal views were, that's a little bit harder to unravel. And you cited that White House tape, which is certainly evidence that he certainly had some racial animosity, as did so many people in those days. Uh, on the other side of the ledger, he always claimed, "I don't have an ounce of bigotry in my nature," and talked about how his father Jack, who was an you know Irish American Catholic who experienced discrimination and taught the family to be better than that, how he wouldn't take the family to see Birth of a Nation. And it's true that I talked to Patty and Ron, they're Reagan's kids, and who told me that he certainly raised them not to be bigoted, and he was particularly good on immigration. He was very much pro-immigration, and he was also very good on anti-Semitism. He was really horrified by the Holocaust, and then quit a country club in LA that wouldn't admit Jews. But he had a very troubling record on civil rights, and you know nobody could really say what was in his heart and his soul, even though he kept saying, like, I don't have any bigotry in my heart. Hard to say what was in his heart, but there was no question that in terms of his actions and what he actually said and did, he catered to white bigotry for political advantage.
And I think that's kind of the issue in terms of how we distinguish between like Donald Trump and Ronald Reagan. I think the challenge with Reagan is that he was, and you've described this both in your interviews with CBS and then also in your piece that I mentioned earlier, in that Reagan was very much a loner. He did not show his true hand except to Nancy and his kids. But even then, it's kind of harder to get into that. But with Trump, it seems like there is this incessant need to put his heart out on display, to tell you who he is from the very beginning. And to the extent of Trump's rhetoric differing from Reagan, to what extent would you say that these approaches are harmful to the body politic? Obviously, mistruths play a role, but I think like there's a something to be said about the distinctions in how they approach their rhetoric.
I'm not quite sure I get the question, frankly.
I'm guessing what I'm trying to say is, whereas Reagan was more subtle, Donald Trump is more bombastic. Which would you
Yeah, yeah.
say is more harmful
Oh, yeah.
to the body politic and to the discussions that we had?
Oh, I would say bombastic is more harmful because, you know, Trump doesn't make any effort to hide his bigotry. I mean, he kind of wears it on his sleeve proudly and trots it out for political effect. I mean, I guess, you can certainly argue that what Reagan did was corrosive as well, but I think, he kept within like the 40-yard lines of American politics, and he respected, you know, certain a certain amount of decorum, which Trump certainly does not. And Reagan also showed some ability to moderate his views. I mean, for example, in 1966, when he was running for governor of California, he campaigned against the Rumford Fair Housing Act, which was a piece of legislation backed by the incumbent Pat Brown, which prohibited discrimination in the sale or rental of housing. And of course, campaigning against it made him more popular with white voters and helped him to get a big margin. But once in office, he did something that he had apparently never done before. He actually talked to African American leaders about the legislation and why they thought it was necessary, and announced that he wasn't going to push for its repeal because he understood what an important symbol it was for the minority community. So, Reagan also, while he certainly played to disreputable prejudices, he also had a tendency to move to the center and to be more pragmatic in office, which is something that I have not seen any evidence of Trump doing.
Yeah, and that kind of goes also to the historical memory issue here, where it comes to like Donald Trump. We were obviously he's been pretty negatively viewed overall, even from the beginning of his presidency, whereas Reagan has kind of had a rose tinted view. And I guess obviously in some cases the presidency kind of makes that kind of glory kind of follow the historical figure. But do you think that part of the reason that Reagan is viewed so differently, or at least with some elements of difference, is due in part to his rhetoric? And also, is it also due to sometimes a little bit of Nancy Reagan's influence?
Well, there's a lot to unpack there. I mean, I think the reason why Reagan is looked upon more favorably, and the reason why he was able to, appeal across partisan lines, and ultimately in 1984 to win 49 out of 50 states, and to engender, especially after his retirement, he also engendered a fair amount of sympathy and support from a lot of Democrats. I think there are two basic reasons for that. One is that he had a very pleasing personality. I mean, it was very hard to be exposed to the Reagan personality and to hate Reagan personally. I mean, even people like Tip O'Neill and others who were his political opponents could be charmed by Ronald Reagan. He was a very charismatic individual, and he knew how to talk to people. And he didn't call his opponents names. He referred to Democrats as our friends. He didn't call them vermin or the enemy of the state or whatever. And even with the press, for example, he had sort of an adversarial relationship, and they would ask him questions that he would ignore, and they would become frustrated. But then he would wisecrack with them. And actually, I talked to reporters who covered him who said, Reagan, it was very hard to dislike him. He was just such a nice guy. You couldn't really hold a grudge against him. So that's, I think, and his public persona kind of communicated that, and made him very acceptable, even when he was advocating kind of hardline Republican positions. He did it with kind of a wink and a smile and a quip and an anecdote in a way that was not very threatening. And so that's why he was much more successful than like Barry Goldwater, for example, who was a much harder edged Republican. So that was part of his, you know, nonpartisan appeal. The other part of it, of course, is what we were just discussing, the fact that he could cut compromises and engage in bipartisan wheeling and dealing. And remember, throughout his presidency, Democrats always controlled the House. So he had to work with Democrats to get anything done. And he did. I mean, he cut deals with Tip O'Neill and, in 86, signed an immigration law that legalized millions of undocumented immigrants. He cut taxes, but he also raised taxes. So he did a lot of things that won him a bipartisan support. And you just don't see much evidence of that these days from the Republican Party. I mean, Trump's whole strategy is to mobilize his base based on grievance. It's not to enlarge his base or to win over Democrats. I mean, everything he does makes that impossible.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that strikes me about the distinction between these two figures is not just that, there's a difference in rhetoric, but I think there's a difference in the media context. I think with the destruction of local news through private equity firms like Alden Global Capital and the destruction of local newspapers, I think what we have also is just a fundamental disconnect from community, which is interesting because the internet is in theory supposed to connect us a lot more. And this is a bit of a hypothetical, but if Reagan was in the media environment that we live in today, do you think he would have responded in the same way that he did in his time period, or do you think he would be more similar to Trump or something else entirely?
Well, I couldn't imagine him being similar to Trump because that's just not his personality type. He just was not a name caller. He was a consummate gentleman. But it is interesting to speculate how he would fare in today's media environment, which was so different from when he was in office. And that certainly contributed to his success. The fact that uh, there was still a media environment where people got their news from a big newspaper or from one of the three television networks. Basically, in the 1980s, there was no Fox News, no Rush Limbaugh in national syndication. no, Breitbart or all these other crazy websites, and so there was basically kind of a commonly agreed upon set of truths that people subscribed to. I mean, they had different political opinions, but they still there was an overlap in terms of how people saw the world because it was basically shaped by these news sources that had editors and mainstream views and tried to fact check and enforce factuality. And ironically, that began to change in the Reagan presidency when his FCC lifted the fairness doctrine, which meant that radio and TV stations no longer had to present both sides of issues. They could just be as partisan and ideological as they wanted. And that's really what made possible the rise of Rush Limbaugh and all these other talk radio people. And then, of course, you had the launch of Fox News in the 1990s. And then, of course, came the internet and social media. And now we're in a position where there is no commonly accepted truths. I mean, this kind of reminds me of Daniel Patrick Moynihan's old line about how everybody's entitled to their own opinions, but they're not entitled to their own facts. But today, everybody does have their own facts because so many people get their information from social media feeds where the algorithms are basically telling you what you want to hear, whether it's strictly factual or not. And so that's a very, very challenging media environment, which I think really is is corrosive for our democracy and promotes hyper polarization and partisanship. And it's really completely different from what Reagan encountered. So I don't know how he would fare in today's environment. It's very toxic.
Yeah, and I gotta say, like, one of the things I got my start in opinion journalism on the college level. So my attitude was, we even commentators who engage in, a little bit of a polemical fight still depend on a basic understanding of a common media, a common set of facts, a common set of methodologies, a common sense of approach. But right now it seems like what we've seen with Donald Trump and really the destruction of that kind of environment is a desire to rise above it or just ignore it altogether. And you mentioned how Reagan brought about the end of the fairness doctrine. So to some extent, it could be argued that Reagan contributed to the media environment that basically made his kind of politics irrelevant. And to what extent do you lay the blame on Reagan for some of our current media environment, or do you think it was a bunch of other factors that might have been like somebody else would have done it if it weren't him?
I mean, probably somebody else would have done it if it weren't him, but his administration certainly contributed to it with lifting the fairness doctrine. I think also more broadly, basically eviscerating enforcement of antitrust law, which allowed many more media mergers and acquisitions and led, to the demise of a lot of local media and the rise of these giant media conglomerates, and that all of that radically changed the landscape. I mean, of course, the other thing which has radically changed the landscape, Ronald Reagan had nothing to do with, which was the internet, but that's also been probably the most impactful part of the media equation today. So, I mean, I don't want to exaggerate the degree that Reagan contributed to where we are today, but he certainly played at least a small role in that.
Yeah, and then to kind of jump away a little bit from the media perspective, I think one of the things that keeps being brought up, especially in this election cycle, is the rule of law and the trust in the institutions. I think even though Reagan was obviously a lot more inclined to handle them with care, he still had his share of legal faux pas, to put it lightly, such as Iran Contra. And one of the things I've kept hearing a lot about, or at least on my side of the aisle, is that Reagan wasn't that much different from Trump in that he seemed to kind of view restrictions on his influence uh, negatively, especially when it came to the investigation into what happened with the Contras. Do you agree with that assertion, or do you feel as though that the degree matters more, like the degree of the corruption?
Yeah, I would not say Reagan was personally corrupt in any way. I think that's the difference. I think he was actually generally pretty honest, but he was also a terrible manager, and so didn't really know what was going on in his own government. In his case, I think it was more oversight than malfeasance, which is why, for example, he wasn't impeached over Iran-Contra. I mean, the irony of Iran-Contra is that it was the fact that Reagan didn't really know what his subordinates were doing that got us into Iran-Contra in the first place, because, as you know, The Reagan administration sold weapons to Iran to get U.S. hostages released from Lebanon, and then John Poindexter and Ollie North illegally funneled the proceeds to the Nicaraguan Contras. And if Reagan had known about the diversion of money in violation of the Bullen Amendment passed by Congress, that would have been an impeachable offense. But just as his lack of attention to management got us into that mess, it also kind of provided his alibi because, when Reagan said, I didn't know anything about it, people believed that. I mean, if Richard Nixon had said that he didn't know anything about it, that would have nobody would have believed that because Nixon was very hands on, but Reagan was not. And so that was ultimately obviously a big problem. The fact that the president of the United States didn't know a lot of what was going on in his own government. It wasn't just Iran Contra. There were a lot of scandals at HUD and elsewhere in the government, and he didn't do much to enforce ethical standards. But I don't think that he was, personally corrupt. I don't think he was personally motivated by money making. And even during the Iran Contra affair, it never would have occurred to him to try to interfere with the investigation or tell the attorney general what he could or could not look at. He never invoked executive privilege to prevent Congress from seeing documents. He actually cooperated with all the investigations, which is another reason why he wasn't impeached. So, I mean, I think that the differences are pretty substantial, although there was, quite a bit of sleaze in the Reagan administration, no doubt about it.
Yeah, and I one of the things I kind of try to remember, especially when dealing with figures that are compared to one another, is that not all historical figures are comparable, and also just because historical figures hold significant similarities in some respects doesn't mean they existed in the same context or should be seen in the same way. But in terms of where the Republican Party is now and how that's really been affected by both like Donald Trump and those around him, especially like with figures like Roger Stone, who also worked with Reagan a bit. Uh, would you say that Reagan would recognize his party, or would he condemn it? Obviously, hypotheticals and outside of historical context have limitations, but it would be interesting to see your thoughts on how he'd view the Trumpist Republican Party.
Well, again, this is pure speculation, but my speculation would be that Reagan would not really understand the current Republican Party, but he probably wouldn't condemn it either. Again, as we talked about, he was very different from the Republican Party on a range of issues, from being, pro-immigration to pro-NATO, and he certainly did not engage in personal invective. And kind of more broadly, he had a very optimistic, sunny, upbeat view of the world and of America. He saw America as a city on a shining hill. He would certainly not be referring to it as a failing country. I mean, that would be anathema to him, and he would not be engaging in all this personal invective that is, part and parcel of the way that Trump speaks. So, I suspect if he were still alive, he would probably be denounced by a lot of Trump Republicans. They would be calling Reagan a rhino, Republican in name only, which is the term that they use for, Liz Cheney, Dick Cheney, Mitch McConnell, a lot of other kind of more traditional Republicans. But, would that cause Ronald Reagan to, if you were, hypothetically, if he was still alive, would that cause him to denounce the Republican Party? I would guess probably not. I mean, there's very few prominent Republicans who have done that, Dick Cheney being one exception, but you don't hear a lot from George W. Bush or, a lot of other living Republicans. I think Reagan, like them, would probably place, loyalty to party above his concerns on the direction over the direction that party is taking, because Reagan often cited his 11th commandment, which was "Thou shalt not speak ill of a fellow Republican," and I suspect that would probably still hold today.
Yeah, it's an unfortunate thing that partisan identity is really such a fixture in our politics, because even though like I've worked on campaigns before, I've worked with like Elizabeth Warren and Raja Krishnamurthy's campaigns respectively. One of the things that I've always hoped for is, at the very least, in theory, the body politic is the means by which we communicate ideas, policies, and cooperate as a country. But even figures that are somewhat glorified in our histories are still susceptible to that. But to lead into my last question, and that's January 6th, the role in which law and order plays a role in Reagan's ideology, it seems very much entirely anathema to the state of how the Republican Party is talking about January 6th today and even almost immediately after that. So, to what extent do you think like Reagan's legacy and his perspective would really serve as like a contrast, like basically, how do I say this? A way that can be like contrasted with Donald Trump's, because it seems to me there is this victim mentality rather than a presumption of improvement. And you mentioned that in terms of how Reagan viewed America being more rosy than Trump's.
Oh, I'm sure, again, this is all speculation, but I'm sure Reagan would have been horrified by January 6th. I mean, it never occurred to him to challenge the results of an election. And to be fair, he won most of the races that he ran, but he did seek the Republican presidential nomination in 1968 and 1976, and in both cases lost the nomination fight and never accused the winner of first Nixon and then Ford, never accused them of stealing the election or engaging in voter fraud or anything like that. He just accepted the results and, in fact, endorsed the winner. So I'm sure that would have been his attitude. I mean, I think it's truly inconceivable that any previous president would have actively, tried to incite an insurrection or overthrow the results of an election. It's just certainly can't imagine it happening, and certainly would not have happened with Ronald Reagan. I mean, he had an almost mystical belief in democracy and believed that democracy, reflected the will of ordinary Americans, and he had tremendous faith in the wisdom of ordinary Americans. I mean, I don't know that I necessarily share that faith, but he certainly had it, and I don't think he would have done anything to tamper with the way that ordinary Americans express their will through the ballot box.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate your perspective on it. I Geez, I can't talk today. If you want to give any final remarks, I'd greatly appreciate it.
Well, thanks. Thanks for having me on. I think it's been an interesting and enlightening discussion. I hope that I hope your listeners check out Reagan: His Life and Legend, which is now a New York Times bestseller and has been acclaimed as the definitive biography by the New Yorker. So very, very strong reviews, and I hope that you're motivated to go on to Amazon or Barnes and Noble or your local bookstore and check it out.
Thank you very much. Thanks for joining me.